This conference will now be recorded.
All right, hello and welcome to Drawing Figures. So we're gonna get into it, and basically I wanted to start off by showing you that there's a ton of different approaches to drawing the figure. Um, each one of them has its benefit, each one has its detriment, and we're gonna utilize all of these different types of figure drawings in order to accomplish the goal of drawing figures. Um, I think when I started out, I kind of made the mistake of not really appreciating how valuable these rougher, looser types of sketches are. But especially for animation, here I'm going to show you some animation for a moment. Like those drawings, they're kind of shitty. Like if you took one of those individual drawings, they're just like loose lines and kind of messy. But that's the foundation of how you draw the figure, right? It the other stuff on top of that, the shape design, the anatomy, that's all kind of like the icing on the cake, whereas the groups of figures you see laid out before you, that's like the building blocks, so to speak. So I kind of imagine it like if we were making a sculpture, a lot of times you start out with a wireframe maquette, and then on top of that you place the clay. Today, we're going to be doing that wireframe. We're going to figure out how do we make the structure of our characters, how do we get the gesture and all that kind of stuff. Later on, we'll get into more of that icing on the cake or that clay. We'll get into shape design, we'll get into anatomy, cloth, hair flow, all that kind of stuff, but not today. What else? I think as a rule of thumb for the class, things that I want to see are really strong silhouettes. Seems like a lot of you do a great job of that. But like one thing that I like with, or one thing that I really try to do with my drawing is make sure that all of the silhouettes are really obvious, right? You can see the entire silhouette, you know exactly where the outline is. It's never confusing. And that's not to say that there aren't instances in art where you want to have silhouettes that are a little bit less or a little more ambiguous. But I think for the sake of this class and just for animation, it's a good idea to be comfortable making strong silhouettes. The other thing I want to try to instill in you guys is confidence in line work. So even if let's say you're sketching loosely, right? I'd rather not see a bunch of short staccato brushstrokes, like hairy brushstrokes, and I'd rather see more long, fluid brushstrokes. I think in general that feels nicer. Let's say you're scribbling in a mess or whatever. Find and define that shape and commit to those lines. Our goal for a lot of this class is to get to maybe a finished pencil work right before you'd ink over it. So a lot of these, like if I was doing an animation, I would do one more pass over this where it's like fully clean lines, but we're just bringing it to that more finished pencil look. Cool. And yeah, I've got some Aladdin over here, right? Like this is the cleaned up, more inky kind of lines. Not exactly where we need to go. We're looking for more like this or kind of like that for today, at least. Cool. A lot of you had some really great figures, so I'm hoping you get a lot out of this class. If not, write a bad Yelp review, I guess. All right, so let's get into each one of these models and how they're going to benefit us. So there's no one way to draw a figure, and each one of these has its uses and its drawbacks. A lot of times I feel like students pick one way and then they're just settled in that way of doing it, and then they have trouble getting out of it. We want to use each one. So our stick figure is great because it gives us these angles of the shoulder and the pelvis, and it's a pretty instinctual way to draw, right? It's not too difficult. There's not much form going on, not too much detail. And oh man, Clip Studio is lagging. Sorry about that. But yeah, it's really sort of a straightforward kind of thing where we just have our lines for our pelvis and shoulder line, and then our limbs are just sticks. So it's easy to draw, not too difficult, and it gives us a good sense of gesture and pose. Obviously, the drawbacks to this are most people don't want to look at a stick figure and they're going to look at it and go, okay, where's the rest of it? So the cons to that is it needs more information. It's leaving a lot to be desired. All right, next is our sort of scribble figure. I like scribbling. I think it's the most innate way to draw. It's a really valuable way to draw. It's what children do. And a lot of times I'll use scribbles as the underlying basis for a figure drawing. So if I was doing this traditionally, I might go in and scribble with a really light colored pencil, and then just do cleaner line work on top of that. So it gives me a nice framework to sketch. I think scribbling is a really great way to draw from imagination. A lot of times when people say, "Oh, I can't draw from imagination," wait, hold on. You said you can't see the screen. Should be working. I think that might be on your end. Yeah, a lot of times when people say they can't draw from imagination, I think it's just that they're trying to draw well from imagination. Everyone can draw from imagination. Sometimes it just looks like shit. Sometimes it doesn't. So be okay with it, looking a little bit like shit. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. And we always want to, if you're doing practice, you want to target your practice to a specific thing. So say you're trying to get better at drawing from imagination. Well, scribbling is a perfect way to do that because you're not too concerned about how it looks. You're just worried about getting the information out of your brain onto the page. So that's, I think, the value of scribbling and being loose. The next one is our skeletal figure. This is like sort of like the stick figure, but with a little bit more information. Now we've separated the masses of the skull, rib cage, and our pelvis. And I think it's really important to identify where those masses are, because that's kind of the main things we're going to be tracking when we're animating or when we're drawing a figure is how are those forms interacting with each other? How are they twisted? How are they turned, etc. You could add a little bit of form information to these limbs, but don't worry about it for now. For now, we'll just think of them as little sticks. Obviously, again, the sort of drawback to these first four is that they don't really exactly look like what you're drawing. So if you're doing the skeletal form, it doesn't look like a final drawing. I also prefer not to always work inside out, meaning like if you look at classical artists, they kind of start this way where they draw the forms and then sort of add the muscles on top and then sort of build up. I prefer to start from the outer silhouette, and let's talk about why. I think the silhouette, the value of drawing in silhouettes and shapes is that you're really in control of the final piece or the final product of what people are seeing. So the final part of a drawing is the 2D shapes that it's composed of. So when you're drawing in silhouette, it's a lot easier for me to go in and change this shape to whatever I want it to be, than it is for me to go in with one of these other ones and kind of mess around with what that looks like, right? Let's say we want to give them stick legs, or if I want to give them really wide legs, right? Whatever it is, you when you work in silhouette, you're very in control of what the final shapes are. The concern there is that by drawing in shape, we're losing a lot of the form information. So we're losing some of the stuff that we get from the building blocks, and maybe a little bit of information about that twist and turn of the rib cage and pelvis. But very valuable way to draw, and it's I think similar to scribbling. Drawing in the silhouettes is very similar to how we would draw when we're children. And I think the more you can get into that state of mind where you're like kind of drawing as if you're a child, I think you're better off and you'll end up using more intuition. So these two are going to be very, very important later on down the road. Sorry, Clip Studio is not happy with GoToMeeting. So I'm just, yeah, it's all right. Not that big of a deal. Okay, light and dark. This is a way that I like to draw. We'll talk a little bit more about rendering forms next lesson. But I think understanding the shapes of light and dark is really valuable and gives you a lot more understanding about how the 3D forms work. It's kind of like the other side of the building blocks, right? If I'm drawing forms like cylinders, yeah, I can use wrapping lines to show that dimension, but I can also use value and shadow to sell that information as well. So you don't always need wrapping lines and that kind of thing to show volume. Sometimes using light and shadow is even more important. And I use light and shadow all the time. You can see all my figures. I usually will do a shadow pass on them. And I think that adds to a lot of believability. I think it gives us, if you think about shapes of light and dark, it gives you better ways of simplifying your figures. I know for me, a lot of my lines will, since we're drawing dark lines on light paper, I try to emphasize lines that would be in shadow. And so that dictates a lot of where my line weight is going to be. All right. And then the two that we're probably going to focus on for most of the day is our basic building blocks and our more complicated forms. These two are really, really valuable for showing three-dimensional volume, showing how things fit in perspective. But the drawback to them is that I think they can be a little too rigid for people sometimes, right? Like if you're working in building blocks, you're less inclined to do things like mess with the line of action or simplify your shapes or really like explore different shape designs. So these two are really good for giving us dimension and perspective, but they have some drawbacks and they can really stiffen up poses if you're not comfortable using them and if you're not comfortable playing around with shape and form. Any questions about that? Do we want to do a little bit of exercises to start this off? I mean, I want to do that. I don't know if you guys are.
I would
to
like
join.
that. Yes.
Cool.
I would also like that.
I'm
Yeah,
cool.
definitely.
Oh, you guys are talkative. It's awesome. I appreciate that.
I'm curious, James, do you ever start with one of these methods and then elaborate on it through another method, or is it usually used one at a time?
It's like a weird hybrid of all of them combined into one, right? So depending on a pose, let's say a pose has a lot of twisting to it, I'll probably use a little bit more of these sort of building blocks because it gives me more information about how the pose is turned in 3D space. Or a lot of times when I'm animating, I'll just draw it in the silhouette because this building block stuff is already sort of in the back of my head. So I'm not too concerned about, I already know what's happening. So I'm not too concerned about like, I'm not too concerned about sort of reminding myself what those forms are doing, if that makes sense. Like I can look at that silhouette of an arm and know that it's essentially a cylinder that's kind of going back in space like this a little bit. And then the forearm is coming at us just a little bit more. So that comes with time. Part of our homework assignment this week is going to be drawing the figure with these different versions. So let's get started. Warning, there is going to be nudity in this class, but I'm assuming you knew that given that it's a figure drawing class.
Hot.
Oh my God.
Oh,
Butts. What are we gonna do? Okay.
My virgin eyes.
Oh no. Okay, so when we're starting out with our stick figure, I think one of the things the stick figure does best is capture this shoulder versus pelvis tilt. This is gonna be one of the main things that's super crucial in getting a gesture to feel comfortable, right? That as well as the line or the lines of the spine. So we can do this in a few ways. You could draw in your line of action, which is just like if you were to simplify our the trunk of the body, and then just a line for our shoulders. And then if you look at the butt or the hips, you can kind of get an angle for that. Then we're just going to draw in our limbs. And I'm sort of demarcating where the joints are, right? So our knee and our elbows. And if you've figure drawn before, you're probably familiar with this. So I'll draw this off to the side. A few things that we get out of this. Really important to get the angle of, like I said, the tilting of the shoulders and the hips. It's very, very important to making gestures look natural. You get a lot of proportions this way as well. Right? It's like a nice way of practicing proportions.
So James, quick question.
Mm-hmm.
You drew the hip line at the bottom of the butt, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking before I think where I learned it from is like on the hip itself, like
You can do that as well.
pelvis, but so there's no hard and fast rule for that, right?
No, I don't think so. I don't think there's any rules for any of this stuff, right? It's really just like whatever works for you. If you want to do it at the hip line as well, you can definitely do that.
Okay, awesome.
Cool. All right, now I'm gonna just do another one, but we're gonna do the skeletal version of this, which is essentially just adding in a sort of an egg shape for the rib cage, and then just imagine sort of a circle for the hips right now. We're not really thinking too much about volumes, anatomy, or anything like that. We're just trying to get a sense of the gesture. And pay attention to things like how are the legs angled, right? Don't just sort of assume you know what's going on with the legs. Really pay attention to the tilts of those. All right, the legs kind of angle in. You'll notice I sort of drew this at an angle.
I'm curious, James. It seems like you're being very careful to include like the joints of the elbows and the knees.
Mhm.
Is it okay if it seems like more of like could be conveyed through like a curve or a gesture to do it in that way, or is it specifically good to include those joints?
Yeah, whatever way works for you. In this case, I like to include the joints just because I don't know, for me that works. But if you want to just do an overall just gesture for that entire limb, I think that works as well. Here, let's have a look at another one. We'll get into that one in a second. Right, identify shoulder line, hip line, line of action.
I have a question, James.
Yep.
So this is probably a dumb question. It's like very like level 1 question, but like when do you usually decide or when do you usually figure out like when to use straights and when to use curves, specifically on like the arms, for example?
That is definitely not a level 1 question. I think, let's see, I think the way I think about it is I'll have one side that emphasizes the line of action. So let's say the arm was sticking out like this. Now I want to have the underside of that arm. Here, this will be our hand so you can see what's going on. In this case, I would let the underside be a straight, and then the upside or the top side have a little bit more of that information. I think it depends on which side demonstrates more of the movement. So if the arm was bent, for example, like we bent the arm, like we're doing a bicep curl, this is our line of action. It makes more sense to have the underside here straight, and then the bicep, which is now flexed, to be curved, because we're emphasizing the flexing of that muscle.
Okay. And then when you're doing, let's say, like for example, what we're doing now, which is the base, like skeletal kind of like with a little bit of information with the rib cage and like the waist. For the arms, like would you simply just do like a straight line, or does it really depend on like the image that you're like studying, for
For
example?
these, to keep it simple, I'm just using straight lines for both of them. Not too worried
Okay.
about straights versus curves.
Okay.
Yeah, you could definitely, like we could work on that a little bit, but right now I'm just doing, just keeping it nice and simple.
Okay, cool.
James, do you often kind of like in this pose, you see the upper leg kind of like hidden from our sight, right? When
Yes.
we're trying to study it, would you draw it or um would you fill up the missing pieces in the drawing to kind of like learn it, or do you just kind of like just draw what you see?
You should definitely just draw what you see, right? If you're starting, like, we don't want to start adding in more information that's not there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see.
For you animation people, we'll recognize something that's going on here, which is we have a bit of squash versus stretch going on, right? So our overall line of action is curving to the right, correct? So we have the spine and everything leading back towards the right. So what's happening on the right side, because we have that tilt that's going to the left, we're getting a stretch. We're stretching out that form. And on the opposite side, we're squishing that form in because it's being compressed. So you're going to notice a little bit of squash and stretch going on. But right now, just worry about your line of action and your tilt of the shoulders. All right, let's draw in the silhouettes as
Oh.
well. Yep.
Question. For the hands and feet, what do you usually do do you just draw circles when we're doing this loose sketch?
Honestly, you could do triangular shapes. Part of what I want you to
Mm.
do is develop a bit of a shorthand. So, like I mentioned earlier, I do combine all those different techniques together. So one of the ways we can look at it is just what is the overall shape of this thing, right?
Okay.
Something like that, right? We're just trying to get a simple idea. We don't want to worry too much about how we don't want to overcomplicate it, right? So if I'm looking at the hands, maybe I'll even just draw in a very simplified version of that, like almost like a low poly model of that shape.
Okay.
I like doing gestures this way as well. So in addition to just drawing in or doing your line of action, all that stuff, try just drawing using the silhouette shapes. This one's definitely going to be a harder one to do. Like you might struggle with it. You might find that your forms look a little weird, but I think it's a valuable technique to use. And I think it starts, you start to integrate some of these gestural qualities a little bit more as you do this. All right. So that's a general idea about how we can go about practicing these sort of things. Let's talk a little bit more about the theories of the forms of the body, and we'll get into that in just a second. But yeah, I think when you guys are practicing, it's a good idea to practice doing the same figure multiple times over. Each thing is going to practice a different skill. Doing those sort of skeletal stick figures, I find that one of the best ways to really start to comprehend proportions and how the figure's fitting in space and how it bends. You know, don't overcomplicate it. Silhouettes, this starts to integrate this knowledge of the line of action and everything, and it gives me a more practical way of applying this, right? Because for me, I'm not going to draw all this skeletal stuff out. I just want to start sort of playing around with the shapes. So I definitely suggest practicing multiple ways of going about this. So do the same figure multiple times. Before we get into discussing the forms of the body, I want to talk a little bit more with our stick figure about balance and maintaining center of gravity. So let's see how that goes. So in order to keep the figure balanced, you're going to see that whenever we have a hip tilt, the shoulders are going to counterbalance that so that the body maintains its upright position, right? Keeping that center of gravity on the floor. There are times that you want your figures out of balance. If they're, say, jumping or running, they might be tilted forward, so that shifts the balance out of whack. But if they're standing upright, then they're going to be balancing it out. So in this case, the hips are tilted down to the left, the shoulders slightly down to the right. The spine accommodates for that by bending back this way. You see how that shape already kind of braces itself. Then we have what's known as our weight-bearing leg. And you'll see this a lot of the times if we're, I actually don't know which bear this would be. Maybe it's this way. Don't yell at me if that's wrong. You're going to notice that one of the legs, and a lot of times in casual poses, will take on more weight than the other. So in this case, we've got this leg that braces most of the weight, and then one that's bent back, not taking on as much weight. And in this situation, we've got another scenario where the body is sort of counterbalancing itself. He does have a table to balance him out a little bit. Actually, you know what? I've got a better example than that one because the table is doing a little too much. Yeah, here's a good example. All right, we've got our line of action. Our rib cage is tilted forward, pelvis back. And how does he counterbalance? That leg down on the ground and the pelvis leaning back. Let's draw that out. You'll notice that the center of gravity is going to stay right in the middle of the body. So normally, if you're just standing and then you just tilt your rib cage and head forward, you're going to fall over. But what he does is his pelvis dips back that way to counterbalance, and his leg is bent. So it's important to keep in mind that relationship of these forms and draw poses where the body might be out of balance. This is going to help you figure out how that tilting is working and how the body naturally compensates for any sort of disturbances. Right? We could just come up with one, and if we just tilt the body over to the left a bunch, right? We're pushing all this weight over to the right. What's going to happen? Now we're going to have to brace that weight. Maybe we'll do something like, you know what we'll do? We'll bring that center of gravity back. Turn the foot out. You can even do something like this. Actually, yoga poses are a great thing to look at as well. So the body, like I said, is always trying to maintain that center of gravity and make sure it doesn't fall over. Cool. All right. We're ready to look at forms and how we can figure out how perspective or characters fit in 3D space. This is sort of the meat and potatoes of the class. It's going to be a little bit more complicated, but I think it'll be very valuable. And then we'll talk a little bit more about proportions and shape design after. All right, let me get some static poses. Cool. So the main thing we're going to focus on is the trunk of the body and the skull. So these things are going to really dictate how the body is moving around. And I think one of the easiest ways to understand how those fit in perspective is kind of just using rectangular forms for that. So if I rotate this slightly in perspective, we're going to have none of the nuance of the figure right now. We're just going to keep it very, very simple. So the way I've simplified this is we have our rib cage, abdomen, and our pelvis. Another way you can think about it is if we have a rectangle, we just divide that in half and then divide this bottom half in half again. And so this top half is all the ribs. In between is our abdomen. And then that lower third is our pelvis. Cool. Like I mentioned, you're going to lose a lot of the nuance of the anatomy when you're doing this, but this is going to help us understand the perspective and form. We want to get really comfortable with these, with these forms. So what we're going to do is try to manipulate them and get comfortable manipulating them. So imagine taking this sort of 3/4 block, just bend it back. And bend it forward.
I'm starting to get flashbacks from the animation class about cubes.
It always comes into play, unfortunately.
God damn it.
Yeah.
It's back.
And if you guys have questions about rotating forms, please ask them now, because this is kind of what we're going to get into, is like how we rotate these forms. I'll go a little bit more in depth about appropriately or how to rotate a cube. But that is going to be the major building block for how we fit characters in perspective.
And James, how would the box look like if it was like, I don't know, twisting, something like that?
Wait, what was that? I missed that.
How would the box look like if it was like twisting?
If it was
Makes
twisted,
sense.
oh, okay. Well, you could do something like the key to anything twisting is that you get a little bit of that. You're showing one side and then the other. You could do tilting to the side. And part of what we want to do is incorporate that stuff we were talking about when we're doing the tilt of the shoulder and the hips. We want to incorporate that here, but we want to add just a little bit of volume to it, right? Don't worry about if this is super accurate or inaccurate. Just try to get comfortable playing with these forms and making them more organic, right? Right now I'm using these sort of hard-edged box shapes. I'm doing that right now so that the perspective shows a little bit more, but we're gonna round those out and make them feel a little bit more organic in just a second. But we want to keep in mind, like in this case, this bottom one, we have the line of action tilting to the left. And so what are we doing? We're starting with, let's do that again. Start with our line of action tilting to the left. Our hip line, shoulder line. And then I'm just adding some dimension in there. All right, let's bring our 3D model into this. I like to work, when I'm doing these sort of forms, I like to bring 3D models into the question because I think it makes it a lot easier for me to understand, and just makes this whole concept a little bit simpler.
He's back.
Yeah, the muscle boy. Trigger warning, pecs of steel about to come on screen.
Does he have a name?
Yeah, he does. So one of the ways that I like to go about this is I give myself what I refer to as my reference cube to understand where my camera is located. So we have our reference cube. And I'll draw out I'll show you our few angles that we're going to do. We're going to start at 0 degrees where we're looking at it in front. 45 degrees. We're looking at it in side view. And then we'll do 90 degrees, which is just the profile view again. Cool. All right, I'm going to start. Actually, let's start in our 45 degree angle. I think that'll make this the most clear. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to imagine that everything we're basically making a mannequinized version of this character. Let's remove his arms for a little bit. Just worry about forms of the body. I'm choosing a perspective where the camera is pretty far away. The reason being is that keeps all of these lines relatively horizontal, right? The hip line, the knees, and the feet. All right, so that's our major trunk of the body. Basically what I'm doing, same sort of thing. I'm dividing, got his main body divided into a rectangle, dividing that in half here, and then this in half one more time. You can use elements like the center line in the body to tell you where your center line is on your form. And obviously when you're looking at something like this, there's no clear dividing line between that plane, but try to imagine essentially where that dividing line would be. Okay. Now our arms, if we look at the gesture lines for the arms, right, they're going straight down or a little bit back and then forward at an angle. This is where we have to start using cylinders to indicate these forms, right? So we'll go into rotating cylinders in just a moment, but I just want to show you, if you remember from the animation class for you animator guys, when we were rotating cylinders, this line, or essentially the direction of this line, is going to be our minor axis of that cylinder. And so anytime we've got a gesture line, we can use that to give us the axis of those cylinders. And if you're confused, I'll do the cylinder rotation thing in just a second.
I have a question on that when you have a second.
Yeah, sure.
The thing I'm wondering is, how do you know which direction the cylinder is going in by looking at the body on a flat perspective like this? Like, what are you looking at for you to go, I know which direction that cylinder is going in?
Oh, okay, so the way I look at it is if you were to distill, like, let's say instead of drawing the entire shape of the arm, I just had to distill it down into one line.
Uh-huh.
Right. I'm just drawing one line as if I just pierced it directly through the arm. And
Mhm.
then if I look at the forearm, it's going at this angle, right?
Mhm.
So that angle is going to be essentially the angle that goes through the cylinder, or the main axis of the cylinder.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if you mean, I'm not sure if I clarified that correctly.
I'm more asking, like, you have your cylinders laid out for your arm right next to your arm sketch here, where you have the bottom of the, the forearm cylinder showing, and then the bottom of where the wrist would be showing. How do you determine that direction when you're looking at a flat image?
Okay. So that goes into sort of rotating cylinders, and we should actually just rotate some forms just to clarify that, because it gets a little confusing. Let me pull that up quickly. So when you're looking, like you said, when you're looking at it in a flat perspective, you don't really see too much of that ellipse shape on either side of the cylinder. I added a little bit just to give me some information, but you could actually just draw it as a flat shape. Essentially, the more that turns towards you, let's do it this way. The more that rotates towards you, the more we're going to start to see the inside of that circle. So in this case, you could have just, I could have just drawn these essentially as two flat lines here, because we're looking at it almost in a side view.
Mm-hmm.
And for our legs here, we have our gesture lines. They're basically just straight up and down. And those cylinders are just going to be straight up and down. So yeah, let's have a look at, I'm actually going to pull up our animation software. Pull up one of the things that we did in our animation class, which was rotating these forms. So let's have a look at the cylinders. Just get the correct layer up. Okay. So cylinders are incredibly useful, and basically rotating our cube and our cylinder is going to be just like the main way that we see the figure in perspective. So I want you to try to think about this somewhat organically. And when we're looking, like, you identified it as sort of an issue, which is like, okay, if we're looking at something in side view, how do we see the depth of it, or how do we see that form? The answer is we really can't. So when we're seeing a cylinder like this in side view, both edges are completely flat. As we start to rotate it towards us, two things are going to happen. We're going to decrease the length of that cylinder. And how circular that ellipse is going to increase. So it's going to become more and more circular as we rotate that towards the camera. So let's give that a go. from scratch. Get these animation notes off the screen. Cool. All right, so I'm going to look at our cylinder in side view. And like I said, when we look at it in side view, it just looks like a flat rectangle. We have no idea that that is a cylinder. When I rotate it all the way to a front view, it just becomes a circle. Right, so two things happen here. The total length of that cylinder is going to change. So as we get to it in a front view, now that length has shortened dramatically. And also we see more of that face. So it becomes just a perfect circle. Let's go halfway through there. When we rotate a circle, we get a shape known as an ellipse. And I'm sorry if this is like review for some of you guys. But we get a shape known as an ellipse, which is essentially just a circle rotated in perspective. It's got two axes. One of those is a minor axis. The other is a major axis, which we're not going to worry about. The reason the minor axis is so valuable is it essentially gives us the tilt of a cylinder. So let me just draw a few cylinders to give you an idea. So in these instances, you can see that the length of the cylinder directly follows the minor axis. So this minor axis essentially is going to indicate to us what direction a cylinder is going in. Now, we don't know how much a cylinder is rotated towards us based on the minor axis alone. So if we look at the animation that I'm starting to do, the minor axis is going to be horizontal all the way through, right? The minor axis is just flat. The thing that's going to tell us how much a cylinder is turned towards us is the degree of an ellipse. So essentially, how circular does that ellipse look? Also, if I'm confusing anybody, please ask questions. I know this is a topic that is frustrating for a lot of people. Right, so the shortest path of this cylinder is going to be just horizontally across the whole time. And you're going to see that reflected in the length of the cylinder is just horizontal the whole time. But what's changing here is the degree is going from completely flat to slightly more circular to completely circular. The other thing that's happening is the length is foreshortening. So as this rotates towards us, the length of the cylinder visually shrinks. How do you figure out the degree to this ellipse, you might ask? That degree, I would say the way to practice that is by looking at 3D reference and then try to match that degree. It does take a little bit of time to get used to how much that degree should change, but try to be gradual with it, right? So with each step that this turns, that degree is going to gradually get more circular, and that length has to gradually change.
In general, James, is the degree of the ellipse like sort of directly proportional to the degree of the tilt?
Exactly.
Like if it's like 45 degrees tilted, then like the ellipse will be half size essentially, like half the width of its full circle.
Exactly. So the more circular it is, the less of the cylinder you're going to see. So it's, like you said, directly proportional to that. Right. So you can see as I'm rotating that, the length of that cylinder is decreasing and gets more circular. Okay, we can do that again, but let's do it at an angle. Actually, you know what? I'll do this on a new layer. And part of the reason this is so important to animating, or sorry, to drawing figures and to animating, is that it's really going to control how we manipulate our figures in perspective. And it's kind of what I'm pretty much always thinking about forms whenever I'm figuring out how our character fits in space, or if I'm going to, use different or more interesting camera angles. It's something that kind of always happens or always comes into play. So I'm going to rotate this sort of at an angle. So in the first one, the minor axis stayed the same the whole time, right? Just was completely horizontal. In this one, I'm going to rotate it at an angle, and the minor axis is going to change the whole time. So in the first case, it's vertical. And then in the next step, it's horizontal, it's at an angle. So I'm imagining it's coming down towards the ground. I'll make some grid lines so that you can see where the floor plane would be. So now in this rotation, not only are we getting a change in the degree of the ellipse as it comes towards the camera a little bit more, now we're getting a change in the minor axis. So initially it's straight up, then it's out at a 45-degree angle, and then it's flat on the ground, or flat back towards my horizon. So you can see that play out right there. Questions about that? Because it is confusing, especially if you've never seen this before.
You always practice like doing that with perspective, like the lines are always kind of like in perspective, or kind of like just if you're looking at the cylinder from like eye level, wouldn't that be just straight lines?
Yeah, you could definitely change where that fits into perspective. I would practice it depending on whatever situation I was doing, right? So if it was a situation where the horizon line, or if my camera was super low by where the feet are, then my horizon would be really flat, and then I would be looking up at this cylinder the whole time.
Okay, yes.
So I would change it depending on what I'm trying to accomplish.
Got it.
Right, so in this situation, we're seeing the underside. So you don't necessarily need to do it as an animation exercise. What I'm going to have you do for the class is I'm going to have you draw those forms directly over the figure. So that way it makes a little bit more sense.
Okay, spoiler alert.
So let me pull up an example of where this comes into play.
James, question.
Mhm.
So usually, so would you typically just like keep the when you're, I guess like when you were starting to practice doing figures or forms, when you would practice doing like the arms, for example, right? Would you use those minor axes when you were studying, or would you just, was it just more subconscious?
No, I would definitely use the minor axis because I think it really gives you that information of like, yeah, I think it helps a lot. I'll show you right now. Like, let's just look at this guy's arms and legs. So like that. Right. Each one of these gestural lines that I made is the minor axis of the cylinder, the cylindrical form that is the body form. So how do we there's two things to figure out now, right? So we have the minor axis. We have to figure out what degree is that cylinder going to be. And that's going to be dependent on how much that's pointed at the camera, right? So if we look at the left arm, this arm is almost pointed directly at the camera, and that arm's foreshortened a lot, right?
Right.
So that cylinder has a degree that's really, really circular. Whereas this arm on the right, we're seeing a lot more of the length of that, right? So in this case, if we were to draw it out, the degree of that cylinder is much more shallow. Like that, compared to almost a perfect circle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I assume like I know you mentioned it before, but like major axes don't really, would you say they're super helpful in this instance when you're trying to figure out like
The minor or the major axis?
the major axes?
I don't do shit with the major axis. I've never used a major axis. I've yet to find anybody to use it.
Okay. And then, oh wait, the other thing too was for knees, like, do you usually keep like, so I see that like you're kind of like keeping space in between. Do you usually like put like a shape in between those, or do you just leave the space?
You can put a sphere for the purpose of doing this exercise. I'm just trying to get you to understand these forms. There's a sort of difference between what you do in practice versus a model that accurately demonstrates something. So like you'll see
Yeah.
in, let's see, let me go back to Clip Studio. Like in this maquette here, the basic building blocks one, I'm putting a sphere there to sort of indicate what's happening. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you can make these forms more complicated, or like in practice, most of the time I'm doing just the silhouette, so I'm not even drawing in those forms. You know what I mean? So for the purposes of your homework, I would do it this way with the maquette. I'm going to get into in just a moment how we come up with, because this maquette that I'm using there is a little bit more complicated than the pure block form guy. I'm going to talk about that in just a second, how we're going about doing that.
Okay, dope.
Yeah. But we will get there. Other questions, other answers. If you guys have the answers, please let me know.
Always searching for answers.
I have all the
Give
answers.
me all the answers. I need them.
As I ask all the questions that should be common sense
I have a
to me.
question.
Yeah.
About the silhouette thing. How do you start when you draw them? Do you go clockwise or do you start with the shoulders and then?
Oh, I don't know. I just go. There's no rhyme or reason to it.
He starts at the dick.
Yeah. That I was gonna say, that's really the question of the class that's on everyone's mind is, are we gonna draw the penises or not? I've been giving everybody boxers. But no, I don't, there's no rhyme or reason to it. And I think in general, there is no right answer to art. So I don't want you guys to be like, oh, this is the strategy, and then you pigeonhole yourself because you're like only starting at the feet or something. A good example would be like, okay, maybe I'll start with maybe I'll normally draw starting with the head, but what if it's a foreshortened pose where the fist is taking up like 90% of the frame? Then I would just start with the fist. It's really context dependent, and a lot of times when I'm animating, especially, I'm just going in, I'm not even really thinking about it. I'm just like trying to just get the pose in place. Sometimes I'm sorry.
Sorry.
No, go.
Asking, do you just stay on the outside or do you draw overlapping shapes and then erase the intersection?
I mean, it'll be like a combination, right? A lot of times I'll sort of start with the silhouette, but then I'll add in some cross sections so that I get a sense of the 3D volumes.
Okay.
So it's kind of like a middle ground between all that, right? If we look at let me pull up the rough pass of animations again. Like I'm even drawing in some of the character design too, right? It's really just sort of like, there's not a lot of thought into specifically how I'm going about it. But you will notice occasionally I'll throw like wrapping lines on the hands or the arms or something, because that gives me some input as to where the forms are.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No problem.
James, how would you how do I say this? How would you like self-correct on like if you got like the cylinder correct, like in terms of like it's so hard to articulate, like if you have
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. How do you figure out if it's incorrect? I would compare to reference. So what you could do is pull up a 3D model. One of the ways I had my students do it in the animation class is I had them start by animating, just copying directly from a reference of a rotating cube or a rotating cylinder. And then gradually over time, you'll start to build that nuance of how that of how that works. Let me pull up some 3D models of forms just to demonstrate this.
Sorry, James, like as a follow-up question,
Yep.
do you attribute like different parts of the anatomy to to different parts of the form? Meaning, like when you draw the cube for the torso, right? Do you think like where kind of like the pec connects to like the delt, like do you think of that as like a corner? You know what I mean? Like the corner of the
Yeah,
cube?
we don't want to think about that just yet, right? We just want to come up with something. We just want to like make it in the simplest form. I don't even want you to think about anatomy yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't. That's pretend we don't even know what anatomy is, and we've never even heard of it before. So it's not the best one, but yeah, I would do something like this where you could get used to rotating it. This is a website called Sketchfab, right? And you can see that principle I'm talking about where in this case, our minor axis the whole time is going to be straight up and down. But what's going to happen is as we rotate it, now that degree is getting wider and wider. Gabe, you're saying hello. Why are you saying hello?
Why does it say sex on the side? And
Where?
it's with this look right to your right.
Oh
I don't know. Let's find
no!
out.
Bruh, I'm so. Oh no no.
Oh
no.
no!
Oh no no no.
All right. Well,
Oh
that's
no, no.
trying to
What have I
derail
done?
class with somebody's weird sex playlist on
No,
Sketchfab.
because this cylinder's in there, and I just want to like, I just want to.
Hey, some people find certain things attractive.
Yes,
Okay.
pegging.
Have you
Yes,
look at how beautiful that primitive geometry is? I don't know what your deal is and why you're being so
that's true.
judgmental.
That's
Don't
true.
kink shame.
I'm so sorry. Anyone that's into that,
Keep it simple, Gabe.
don't speak to me,
You're
but
complicating things.
true.
I'm losing my mind.
Somebody's just really, really attracted to the basic building blocks of the body. Okay, they just have,
Exactly.
yeah, they just have a very thorough imagination.
Dang girl, nice cylinders you got there.
It's perfect.
Like your minor axis.
Oh wow.
That shit is
Goddamn,
great.
class is devolving already on the first day. Okay, so one of the things we want to do with, sorry, now I'm distracted. One of the things we want to do as we get a little bit more comfortable, just want to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, is we don't have to keep everything just as a cylinder, right? Because the body clearly isn't cylinders. So what I want you to do is take your brain for a moment and I want you to just imagine doing a shape, right? And I'm going to make a shape that kind of looks a little bit more like a leg. It's almost as if I'm going to start drawing a leg a little bit. Or actually, better yet, let me do this instead. I'm just going to take the exact cylinder that I have, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the top wider, and I'm going to make the bottom smaller. So I'm just going to do something like this, where a little bit wider on top and tapers down. All right, same idea. But now let's do it at a 45-degree angle. But now we're starting to add a little bit more something interesting to it, right? Because we've got this taper. Let's add a little bit more curve to it. Yeah, there will be like 5 people left at the end of the class. I
God
read
damn
the
it.
chat. I read the chat. See what's going on.
Nothing important.
Yeah. So part of what I want you to do is not just understand how to rotate forms, but now we can take those forms and play around with them, right? If we want, let's see, let's do, take that cylinder, or you know what, let's do, I have a better idea. Sorry about that. Let's take a cylinder. We've got our minor axis, and now we're gonna squish down on this cylinder. All right, so our minor axis staying the same. I'm using this vertical minor axis, but look at what I'm doing. I'm pushing out the silhouette, and I'm compressing it. We're getting a little bit of that squash and stretch in there. So forms are malleable. Forms are not like something that is so rigid that you can't play around with them and experiment and make them more interesting, which is one of the concerns when people start to draw with forms, is they start to lose some of that nimbleness, so to speak. Like you start to lose a little bit of that important stuff you can do with gesture. So one of the ways that I have people experiment with this is, you know, doing what I just did here, where I'm taking a cylinder, breaking it apart, I'm deforming the shape. Here's another way. So we have a squash. I just changed the shape overall. What if we did something like this, where you take a cylinder, and then I'm just going to slice it. Notice always keeping that silhouette very clear. Talk about some line weight stuff in a little bit too. Right, but forms are something that you can play around with. You want to be able to, you want to be comfortable with them to play around with their shapes, sizes, and get comfortable rotating them. Okay, let's kind of did this backwards, but let's talk about rotating cubes, and then we'll rotate the character mannequin, or we'll get into the character mannequin. You guys have questions about what I just did? Because I did some shit that might be confusing.
Sorry, so for those cylinders, the idea is to use like tapered cylinders for like certain forms, like the lower leg and maybe even like the forearms, right?
Exactly. So eventually what we're going to do is use the silhouette shapes that we're looking at. Like, let's say I just look at the silhouette of a forearm or something. Maybe I'll use a shape like that. But now I can add ellipses and wrapping lines to this and start to build 3D volumes out of this. Or let's do, yeah, like a shape that I would use for a forearm. Oh, my cat just showed up. Cat. Might use like a bowling ball pin shape, right? So if you can draw forms around that, or you know, find the ellipses and cylinders, really, really helpful.
Cool things.
No problem.
James, do you have advice for like keeping the size of things constant when you're moving them
Yes.
around in perspective? Or like
Yeah,
building intention for that too?
Definitely. So that actually one of the things that gets confusing is, let's look at the sideways cylinder first for a moment. One thing that can happen, and I see this happen a lot, is if let's say I made the degree really wide and then kept the length the same, what's going to end up happening there is now the cylinder got bigger, right? Because it didn't foreshorten as the degree of that ellipse got bigger. So what I do is I'll make these little marks, right? If I'm seeing it in side view, that's like my 100% that I'm going to see of it. And then when I get into the front view, that's the smallest it's going to be. And so I practice doing halfway steps. So I'm going from here to here, and then, so that's from 0 degrees to 90 degrees. Well, now we got to practice halfway. So our halfway point would be like here and here, with an ellipse degree that's partially between that. And you can see I fucked that up a little bit, but yeah, it'd be like, you just have to do it right. That's the trick. You just have to do it right.
I'm just making sure I understand if you're going like halfway between the smallest distance and the furthest, or the smallest size and the furthest size, the line that correlates to is sort of like the center line of the object. It's not necessarily the external part of the silhouette of the object, right?
I'm confused by what you just said, but I think
So
you
like
might be right.
the ellipses, it's not like the outer edge of the ellipses is where the line is going to line up to. It's sort of like the halfway. It's like the center of the ellipses.
That's
right?
Yeah, that's how I'm doing it. I'm estimating it, right? I'm not, if you want it to be like perfect, use reference and then map it out that way. I'm just going for the general idea of it, just to get it, just to get something that looks correct. And that with these things, like, use 3D reference. That's going to help you be more accurate. But again, it's not always about accuracy. It's just about getting it to a point where it looks correct. That's kind of what I am looking for.
James, is there a way to make that guideline you use for the eye level cylinder for the one in perspective? You know what I mean?
Let's see. So with this one,
There you go.
yeah. So this one, what I did was I essentially established a perspective grid, and then
Right.
made I made a semicircle that it was
Right.
rotating along.
Do you think the guideline will always be kind of parallel to the floor plane?
No, well, I just made this guideline half or parallel to the floor plane. Like I established it that way so that it was. But I don't necessarily think it needs to always be that way. But yeah, if you can imagine, what I did here was like create a semicircle and then rotate along that semicircle. You could do it where you rotate it along this center axis. That would probably be a little bit easier. Yeah, let's do that actually. It'll make that a little bit easier. So let's create ourselves a little perspective grid. I'm doing half of a circle. And then what I'm going to do is rotate around this point. So we'll call that A. And I'm going to do a cylinder with vertical minor axis here. Then we'll have it horizontal. So I'm going to rotate, yeah, like I'm going to rotate in this one that I did at first, I rotated around the center of it. So that made it a little bit more confusing. And I was just kind of going on intuition. For this one, I'm going to rotate it around the base of that cylinder. So that's a little bit easier to do. You see it's rotating around that pivot point. And then I'm going to do the halfway point where that'll be the 45-degree angle. That's got to go up a little bit. Cool. Doesn't need to be perfect. Just good enough to get that minor axis and that degree. My suggestion when you're doing this, you can find perspective grids and work over perspective grids. Just keep it as simple as possible. So I'm keeping the camera far away, so all these vanishing lines are very parallel. So if you're like making a perspective grid, try to make one that your lines are very parallel. It'll make it easier to do. All right, we're gonna rotate some boxes and then we'll apply this to characters so that this isn't so boring.
Yes, boxes, my old friend.
That's what happens, man. You take my class, we gotta start with the boxes.
It always comes back to fucking boxes.
That's art, man. That's just how it is. I hate to do it.
I know.
Art is only box.
Literally only boxes.
Art is box.
Just put a cat inside your boxes and it'll feel better.
Word.
There you go. Just wait till I go through my cubism period.
Oh, Jesus. Cube land.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got our 0 degree, and we're looking at a box straight on. and we've got our 90 degree when we're looking at the other side of the box. Okay, so let's do it this way. Again, I'm not going for perfection here. I'm just trying to get something that reads well. I'm going to keep this length around the same. Perspective scientists have told me that it does actually get a little bit longer in the 45-degree angle. Who cares? Don't worry about it. Doesn't matter.
What did they know?
Yeah, what do perspective scientists know, which is not a title, but all right, so let's label these edges. All right, so when we're looking at the box just straight on, we're just seeing all of one plane. When we get into our 45-degree angle, that edge A is going to be like directly in the center. I'm keeping my horizon line for this example right in the center. So I'm keeping my horizon line dead center. So here's our front. Here's the left, and now the left of the box. Okay, as we rotate it, what you're going to see is we're creating new vanishing points, right? So in this case, we're creating a right vanishing point and a left vanishing point. And those vanishing points are going to move as we rotate the box. So if I'm rotating, in this case, counterclockwise, at first, my left vanishing point is going to be really close. And my right vanishing point is going to be far away. And then as we rotate, that vanishing point is going to move. So in this case, the right vanishing point is coming closer to the box, left vanishing point is going further away. I'm not doing a good job of keeping this form consistent. There we go. All right, so two things happen here, right? Every time we turn, we shift our vanishing points. In this case, if we're going counterclockwise, they're going to shift to the left. And the distance between these vanishing points is going to stay the same the whole time. They're just going to shift across the horizon line. The other thing is, the closer the vanishing point is to a particular plane, the more diagonal these lines are going to become. Yeah, it's not a perfect rotation, but it works. Cool. So why is that important? Does anybody know why any of this shit's important? I can tell you why it's important, but
You gotta draw the box good to draw other things good.
there we go. There we go. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it's going to help us. The understanding how these vanishing lines work is going to help us draw, especially in complicated perspectives. So if we're bringing this guy back, let's get really close up with the camera, because when you do that, we start to introduce more annoying perspectives. So good example here. Right, this left vanishing point, right now we're kind of seeing him like this. The closer we get to a profile view, you're going to see the steepness of these lines get more and more intense. So we can rotate him. And these angles are going to get steeper because that vanishing point's getting closer. So the value of these boxes might be, let's say this is our right shoulder, this is our left shoulder. It's giving us information as to where parts of the body are in 3D space. Cool. Who got banned? What's happening in the chat?
Someone basically said, "Do you know the person named Tyler1, the streamer? Plays a lot of League of Legends."
Oh, I don't know
He
who
like
that is.
Okay, well, he yells a lot and he's very toxic, and this model kind of looks like him.
Oh, okay. He was doing some modeling on the side.
Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised.
Good for him. I'm glad he's super yoked, apparently. All right, let's get some angle on this. Okay, so I'm going to do the mannequin, and we're going to draw it in really basic kind of shitty forms, and then what we're going to do is try to stylize those a little bit more so they're a little bit more reflective of the anatomy. So first, I'm going to start out, and I'm quite literally just going to draw boxes for each form. I'm not even going to add any of the gesture or curvature, really. I'm just going to do boxes. And then we'll do some cylinders for the limbs. if we're confused where our vanishing lines are, use points of symmetry. So creating a line from his feet. I find that the feet are really a valuable area to find some perspective. You do knee to knee, pelvis, chest. Right. The further back I pull that camera, the flatter or less dramatic these lines are going to be. Okay, so as far as our mannequins go, this is kind of my least favorite one because he looks so bad. But if you've never placed forms in perspective and you're like totally lost, it's a good place to start. We didn't add any shape design to the forms. We just did box, box, some cylinders for the legs. I didn't even throw the arms in. See how lazy we are. We didn't even throw the arms in. Okay. Now, part of the benefit of this is we can use that to figure out where characters are in space. But throughout the class, I'm going to start to use some shorthands. So even though I could find the planes of the face using this sort of box for it, you know, I might just simplify that and throw in a shape like this or an ellipse to give that volume, right? If I make any abstract shape and then add ellipses to it, well, now we've got volumes and we can start to find dimension that way. How do we know how an abstract shape is fitting in perspective? Well, I can draw the same sort of abstract shape. Let's do actually the head shape. If I'm looking at it at this angle, that ellipse is completely flat. If I'm looking up at it, now that ellipse wraps up and I can see underneath the chin. Or if I'm looking down at it, right? It's like if we were comparing that to cylinders, if I was staring down at a cylinder, I would see the top side of it. Or if I'm looking up at it, I'd see the underside. So occasionally, I'll start to break into shorthands. That could be something like, instead of using completely flat planes for the box of that shoulder, maybe I'll just start to round that out a little bit, make it look a little bit more like anatomy. All right, we're still getting that information. Now I'm just softening up some of those edges, trying to reflect that shape a little bit more, the shape of real life anatomy. Right, that's combining this blocky dude with the more skeletal version that we started with.
James?
Mm-hmm.
I noticed you don't tilt the boxes for the rib cage and pelvis.
I just did that for this one, just to make it really, really simple.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just to be like, okay, thing is just standing straight up. You're right though that I'm not. That's missing out on the gestures of the forms of the body. So we'll indicate that in just a second, or we'll do.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just doing that so that way, like, if you've never placed a figure in perspective, start real simple. I'm not even tilting the boxes back.
Hmm.
Okay, and just like we talked about before, you know, we were playing around with cylinders and starting to taper the shapes a little bit, right? So instead of doing this, just a straight up cylinder, well, I can make the top portion wider and taper it down like that. Or I can make a bicep shape. And start to build that out. If you've ever read Figure Drawing for All It's Worth by Loomis, he talks a lot about that, making, you know, playing around with forms, making your own forms that are comfortable, things, you know, ones that work for you. And like we started in, like we were talking about in the beginning, each way of drawing is going to have its own values. Like this super blocky dude might be really helpful for figuring out in perspective, but he looks like shit and has no gesture. So you want to mess around with different versions of things. Let's do a little bit more complicated. Okay, so I'm going to start with our blocky boy, and let's figure out what our perspective is. So in this case, we can use things like the shoulders, hands, knees, feet to give us where our vanishing points are. So how do I figure out where that far one is? It's a little bit harder, but I'm kind of just guessing somewhere like, you can kind of use the slope of the head a little bit to figure out where that right vanishing point is going to be. Again, we're looking at organic forms, so it's a little bit tougher. Again, I'm not adding any gesture really. I'm just trying to stack primitive forms.
Is it helpful to do the draw overs, or should we focus on trying to get it without the draw overs and then checking?
I'd do both. Honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with drawing over. I think that might, for me, when I'm drawing separately, or drawing not over the figure, I think it's just clearer to look at, but also kind of trains your eye a little bit more. All right, so that's the trunk of the body, right? We could do this if we wanted to add a little bit more gesture. You see he's kind of leaned back a little bit. What we can do now is, I'm just gonna erase this a little bit. I'm just gonna draw this as one rectangle, and instead of drawing it flat, I'm gonna add a curve to it. Just a little bit of a curve, give it a little bit more nuance. Right, get comfortable bending forms. Right, and we're using essentially that line of action to get that tilt. And now, what about the arms and legs? They're kind of not exactly just straight down, but let's just start with cylinders, and then we'll do sort of the level 2 version of this after. Right, we're looking up at these, right, because the camera's really low. Our horizon line's here on the ground. So if we're looking up, all these cylinders are going up. Cool. That's our stupid box boy. Don't like box boy. So let's take this idea, and now we're going to start to apply a little bit more shape to it, right? So just as we did with the cylinders, where we can push and pull things as opposed to being restrained by the form, let's try to add in some shape. So how are we going to do this? We can do things like just look at the outer shape, like the silhouette. So let's just imagine we're taking that outer shape. Let's add some form to it. For the pelvis, I kind of imagine the pelvis as, I'll show you the transformation. So imagine, start with a rectangle. Then we're going to round out the edges of a rectangle. Kind of like a sushi roll or something. And then from there, I'm going to make the bottom wider than the top. It kind of tapers out like this a little bit. And that's kind of the form that I use for the pelvis. And just add a penis. And you got it. Then you got yourself a pelvis.
What if it's a girl?
Then you add a mons pubis, which is that like protrusion. Yeah, you don't always have to add the penis, obviously.
No, I just saw Squidward. I don't know about you. I just saw Squidward's nose.
There you go.
Bold and brash.
Belongs in the trash.
God damn it. Okay, so instead of just cylinders, now again, we can use that outer shape. And just imagine taking that shape. Let's just add the ellipses that we would have seen in a cylinder. I know it's somewhat easier said than done, especially, like I said, if you're new to this, it takes some getting used to. But start basic. If you're having trouble just getting the perspective, keep it with just straight up boxes. And then as you get more comfortable, start to add more design to these outer shapes and tapering. Why does the apple have a penis? Oh, James said that. Yeah, there you go. Right, so if we just look at this leg shape, instead of, my sort of, as I'm going technique is I'll start with whatever the shape is that I want, working sort of in silhouette. And then if I'm looking up at it, I curve those forms up, or if I'm looking down at it, I can curve those down.
I have a question,
Oh.
James.
Yep.
Do you think so when you're at the point where you're figuring out now like the shape design aspect, would you think it would be a good idea to try to find the shapes on the figure, like drawing over it, like just breaking it down into asymmetrical shapes, or just like shapes that would be appealing? Or do you think it's more like just kind of like looking at it, and then to the side of it, then trying to just feel it out?
So I would do it in a few ways. And right now I'm sort of just I'm just sort of looking at the figure and sort of imitating it. But there's things called, and we talked about it in animation class, there's points in the shape called inflection points. So if we look at, let's just take the same exact calf shape I'm doing. Each one of these points where the shape changes is sort of an area where we can play around with, right? I forget which artist I was just looking at. That was Yo Yoshinari. Imagine we take this point and we just pop it out a little bit and we make it more triangular. Well, now, I mean, I'm being really dramatic there, but you see what I'm saying? I'm taking that inflection point, I'm just changing it a bit. So part of it is looking at shapes that you see in real life. Another part is looking at shape design that you see from other artists and incorporating that and trying to make it more interesting. There's the other thing is, once we start getting into the anatomy, you're going to see that a lot of the shapes are derived from sort of the underlying anatomical features. But I don't want to get into that just yet. I want to just get people comfortable working with mannequins. But yeah, like let's look at that forearm shape for a moment, right? Something like that. And if I'm just sketching over it, so we've got a few inflection points. So I could play around with that and make it really dramatic, or more dramatic than it is, right? Maybe I can even push that shape so that the wrist is thinner and so that forearm really pops out by comparison.
When you're drawing not from reference and you're creating out of your imagination, do you start with the cylinders and build the forms on top of it, or do you just start with the shapes, graphical shapes that you want?
I would start more with shape. Kind of depends a little bit on what I'm trying to do. So if I'm doing a design, like if I'm trying to come up with a new design, I'm definitely more focused on shape. And what I'll do is I'll choose a really easy perspective so that I can just draw the shapes. I would do a perspective where pretty much everything is flat across, like this, right? So that way I don't have to do too much work in terms of figuring out how the figure fits in space. If I was doing something like an animation where I already have a character design, then I might be a little bit more inclined to start working with the forms. Right? I might use wrapping lines and that sort of thing. But yeah, it is somewhat context dependent based on what I'm doing. Part of the reason from the beginning I'm trying to urge you guys to try different methods is because sometimes different methods work for different things. And then as you do each type of method, you pick up things about it that you like. For example, working with the silhouette allows us to really play around with the outer shapes more, right? Because like I said, if I want to just, let's say I want to take, here, let's say this is generally his outer shape, and we've got these couple of inflection points. What I can do, maybe I want to taper the waist down and then I want to push these inflection points out and these ones in so that his waist is tapered in and then his shoulders are out more. And what that would do is, make those shoulders feel wider. Give him a little tiny head so he feels really big. Giant traps. think of like a Mr. Incredible or something, right? He's got a really, really tiny waist, giant shoulders. So the design portion is going to come in once you start playing around with those inflection points.
Quick question, James, with regards to like designing those shapes, because like when you're looking at it from the front view, where there's like everything is flat, there's a different kind of shape for each body part. Like let's say for the body has a different shape in the front view, and then when you rotate it or like look at it in a different angle, there would be another different shape. How do you kind of like figure that out?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question. So there's a few ways. One, we're gonna, after in a little bit, we're literally gonna rotate abstract shapes. That's a skill that we can develop. The other thing is, one thing I've noticed is that it doesn't change as much as you'd think it would, right?
Oh,
so I'll do an example and right after this, and you'll see that it's actually probably going to change less than you might think. Those inflection points are going to be more consistent than you might think. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought like before I asked the question, I thought, am I overthinking it, or because like I see the consistency on your shapes and your like design on your IG post, and it almost doesn't change a lot. So I'm like, I think you're right. So I just have to kind of like know that, you know. So.
Yeah, I mean you're not wrong. So like let's first do, let's just start like this. We'll do draw over for the shape of the torso in front view. Okay. And let's get those inflection points. Okay, so that's our flat 2D shape of the torso in front view. I'm also just going to draw center lines just so that is obvious, just so that form makes a little bit of sense. Now, the most dramatic difference is going to be in profile view, right? That shape isn't going to read. Let's scoot him over a little bit. Yeah, let's get him over here. Okay. Okay, this is when it's going to be the most dramatically different, right? Because we've got 0 degrees, we've got 90 degrees. He's in side view. But take a look at something, right? We've got this inflection point, this inflection point. It's not all that different. It's not all that different, right? And then let's do the 45 degree. I'll scoot him over a little bit. I'll just draw it off to the side. It doesn't want to move him that way. So the biggest thing that's going to happen is that our center line is going to move dramatically. So in our 0 degree, we've got the center line right there in the center. As we rotated him counterclockwise, now that center line is going to shift over here, like so. But if we look at our shape, it's still kind of consistent in terms of where those inflection points are.
So the inflection point just basically adjusts like a little bit, but not
as much as you would think.
Yeah, not as much as like, but it's still there. Like it's still readable, like as the same shape, basically.
Exactly. So one of the ways that would happen is like this inflection point on the right side gets a little bit flatter as I'm shifting that counterclockwise. Right. So for everybody in the class, how I would suggest going about this, I think opening up an animation software or Clip Studio or Photoshop, going to the animation, draw a complicated shape, like just the torso shape or something, draw it in the front view, side view, and then try to do a 45 degree angle. on it. Right? The other thing that helps me with the perspective of that is, let's get this guy out of the way, is just like with the cylinder, I use the degree of the ellipse on the arm socket to help me, right? So in the 45 degree, that degree of the ellipse on the arm socket, that's a little bit smaller, and then it's a perfect circle in the side view, and then we don't see it at all in the front view. So those ellipses are sort of like guidelines that kind of help me. Other little tips are flatten out the shoulder line, and the pec line, or just the chest line, or whatever you want to do. Flatten that out, because then you can use these as guides for where your right vanishing point or left vanishing point are. Right? Do the same when I rotate him. Actually, let's do a down angle. I'm going to draw almost the same shape, but now instead of it being perfectly horizontal, now I've got to go at an up angle to go towards that vanishing point. But I'm almost going to draw exactly the same shape. What are the differences? Well, now got to move that center line over. And if we were going to draw ellipses, we'd be looking down at this. So everything's got to angle down. But use simple tools to sort of figure out where your perspective is. Another thing that helps is, in addition to doing what I just did where I'm sort of constructing the body, just draw or get the figure in a different angle like this, like a complicated angle, and then just loosely sketch the figure out. This is why the silhouette type drawings are really, really valuable. You start to naturally pick up on things like these vanishing lines, but you're training your ability to work in shape. And you're sort of naturally picking up on a little bit of those nuances.
James, is a good goal to have as many silhouette shapes in your visual library as possible, kind of?
I think maybe not as, I wouldn't say as many. What I would suggest is look at artists that you really enjoy. Let me pull up a couple and look at how they simplify their mannequin. Right? I pulled up Aladdin because I just liked how it's really, really simple, right? The shape for his abdomen is just a trapezoid with a couple of scapula, right? That's his torso. So if you can rotate a trapezoid in space, which again, we'll practice that in a second, doing complicated shapes, but if you can start rotating really simple forms, it's less difficult to start to introduce a couple of bumps here and there for the anatomy than it is working the other way per se. So start with simple forms. I wouldn't say try to get as many, but look at artists that you enjoy, right? This is kind of the shape I was doing. Look at character design's ridiculous. This is kind of a perfect example of what I was just talking about before, though, where it's essentially taking those inflection points, stretching them out, just making it more dramatic. So I would suggest looking at artists that you enjoy, try to look at their shapes, see what they're doing. Oh, I love this one this guy's got way too many arms for the purposes of this class. But oh yeah, look at that. epic design. All right, and you can take elements of shape design from that, you know, how they're drawing the shapes they're using for the legs. And we'll go into design theory and talk about shape design more thoroughly. But yeah, really, really great stuff. Based designs for sure.
Sorry, James, for that shape design as well, like I'm curious, like where do you like would we discuss when to use like curves, because those inflection points we can definitely substitute two angles, like two angles in like just a curve, right?
Yeah, well,
Straight.
so like essentially what they're doing here is like the same concept of straights versus curves, but instead of doing a curve, what they're doing is breaking the curve, like you said, into two angles.
Yeah.
You'll see that a lot in anime, which makes it, all the designs are like way sharper.
Mhm.
For context, I'll give you an example. Look at the shape he's using for that leg on the right here. It's kind of like this, right? Something like that. So in traditional figure drawing, essentially what they're doing is the shape on the right is a straight and then a curve on the far side.
Yeah.
All they've done is turn this curve into a triangle or a triangular shape as opposed to just letting it be circular. I think this looks fucking cool. So that's, you're going to notice that I'm just going to sharpen up all of my shapes as I'm doing it, or as I'm, and for me, like one of my like internal rules is if I can turn a curve into something with more of an inflection, I'm going to go ahead and do that because I think it looks cool.
Okay, so that's basically preference at this point when to use like
100%.
Okay.
Because compare this design to
Like Aladdin.
let's compare that to Aladdin, right? Aladdin's got a lot of curves on him.
Yes, exactly. Almost no inflection points, right?
Yeah, the only points are in his hair, really. So that's all a preference thing, you know, how you decide to design your shapes. But let's break down the forms here in Aladdin, because I think I'm going to use his torso shape and we're going to try to rotate that. This is going back to this sort of thing. We're kind of going from our like blocky boy to something that's a little bit more in this vein. Are there any questions, by the way? Because we've been talking a lot. I'll take it as a no, but let's
Just vibes.
Just vibes. That's as long as we got vibes. That's all we need. That's all we've ever needed. Cool. Gabe, I'm sorry I came back to boxes. I couldn't help myself.
God damn it. I'm just giving up at this point. I've just accepted boxes into my life.
Are you giving up on drawing altogether or just boxes?
No, the boxes. I've given up on escaping the boxes.
Oh yeah, you can't escape them.
Yeah.
Not if you're taking my class, you can't escape them.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely not.
You can run, but you can't hide.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay. So let's do abstract shapes. And I'm gonna put a box next to it. Sorry. It's our reference boy. And this is a thing I like to do to build up my understanding of complex forms, or something I did a lot, which was I would start with a reference box to get a sense of how that was rotated in space, but we're doing more abstract shapes. So let's do this. Or 0 degrees, 90 degrees. Okay, now just like when we're rotating the cylinder, when the torso is rotated in a profile view, that's its thinnest point. I'm just going to keep this shape really simple because he's got a really simple body form. And I'll draw in a circle, perfect circle for the arm socket. All right, imagine you have like a little action figure, right? If you ever played with action figures as a kid or as an adult, no shame. Play with action figures as an adult. That arm socket is kind of what I'm drawing here. Okay, so this center line is what I'm going to be using to figure out essentially how this is rotating in space, and got basically 2 inflection points here at the pec and at the back. All right, we got 0 degrees, 45 degrees, 90. Okay. So what's going to happen? Just like with the cylinder, that length is going to shrink a little bit. So we're going to see a little bit less. We get a little bit of these inflection points in there. Right, if we compare this to this. Right, so in 45 degrees, that bottom angle's got to come in a little bit. Our center line is shifting. Let's also draw the top. Right, I'm using these little markers to sort of see how wide it's going to be. So before we even do a full body turnaround, getting comfortable just taking a shape like this and rotating in space, super helpful. Doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, you know? We're not a 3D model, but good enough that it reads. I'm happy with how that looks. I think that's good enough. All right, we're not 3D modelers, but you've got to know enough about the forms of the body so that you can keep them consistent. And the more you can try to keep those inflection points consistent, the better that's going to feel. You know, like if I'm putting an inflection point here, I want it to try to stay at that same level right there. Obviously, if I'm changing the camera height, that's going to affect it, but right now we're doing it at eye level. All right, let's do the back view. Guess what? The back view is the same as the front view. Except we'll add some scapula. My cat is sitting right on my feet. It's awesome.
Let's go.
Yeah. Questions about what I'm doing? Give me the questions. I'll provide the answers. Sorry, I love cat. Yeah, she's the best. I think she's also snoring. Yep. Yeah, she is.
Cannot hear that cat snoring.
Oh my God. I wish you guys could see her right now. She's so good.
I have actually a question related to what we're doing right now.
That's
Do you
good.
think, okay, yeah, do you think that we should like, I guess as practice, just take shapes from just look at shapes that other artists use and just try to rotate them or do them in different angles,
I think that's a good
as
idea.
just like as a way to like kind of like get into the habit of like doing things from different angles and perspective.
Yeah, I think something like this is a great idea. Like looking at this body form from Aladdin and then just try rotating that. I think that's a great idea. Preferably do ones that you like.
Yeah.
Don't do ones that you don't like. But I mean, that's what I'm doing right now, and I think it's a very valuable thing to be doing. You could also try to make ones up if you want, play around with it. Because obviously it's very character dependent. If you want to have like a really super jacked character, maybe you want to stretch out that shoulder width or whatever.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, somebody turned on their microphone. I don't know if they have a question.
Yes. Should we use onion skin at
Oh
this?
yeah, you totally can use onion skin. I just prefer not to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No shade to onion skin. I think my animation class thought I hate onion skin, but
Nah, man, this guy was literally coming after onion skin like the first day. He
yeah, I
just said
started
he
growing everybody.
threw it to hell.
I didn't do any bullying today. I said I was going to bully somebody, but I didn't do it.
Shame on you.
Yeah.
The only thing I will bully is if the silhouettes aren't clear, right? That's the only thing I'm going to get angry about.
Now I'm gonna do it just to see how you respond.
I got a friend who is going to watch this later, and I always yell at him because the silhouettes, he doesn't make them clear.
Oh, Jesus.
So, got to make your silhouettes clear.
Oh yeah. What's gonna be the assignment?
Oh, you'll see. There are going to be, just like the animation class, which I don't think you were part of, but there's going to be 4 levels to it.
Oh boy.
Yeah, the basic level is going to be doing a lot of the loose gestures and some blocky boys. More complicated levels are going to be definitely rotating forms and then complex forms. Later, Vital Ash, thank you for coming and joining. Oh, sorry, Birdie. But yeah, that I'll give you a full write up of what the homework is going to be. I usually make 4 levels so that you guys can do the RPG known as my class.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
I'm curious, James. If we find a reference that we really like the shape language of, or we want to try to copy in this way, but let's say we only have it like it's just like a front view or a 3/4 view or something, and we don't have necessarily know what like the profile looks like, or do you have any advice on how to sort of like come up with that information?
Yeah, sure. So if let's say let's imagine like okay, I'm gonna draw a chunky boy. So let's say we got like this kind of shape in front view, right? It would feel really weird if I did the same profile view as the Aladdin, right? It wouldn't make a lot of sense. So I can kind of surmise from this that one, just from like looking at people and stuff, that the belly is going to stick out. And then to sort of counterbalance that weight, there's going to be like a sort of backwards tilt. So you've kind of got to use a little bit of inclination if you don't have the side view. But I mean, I think for the sake, like if you're already having, or like if you're having trouble with that, I would say just try to find something like go to like SETI Dreams or something. It's a website that just has character model sheets. And just use something with pre-existing character model sheets. That way you kind of really get a sense of how to do this. Oh, it's not City Dreams, it is SETI, the Japanese word. It's like a Japanese word for character turnarounds.
Fucking stealing that. Hello.
There you go. It's a great website. So yeah, and I think the hardest level of this homework assignment is going to be doing your own figure turnarounds of a pre-existing character. Let's see. There
Wait,
were
is it
other.
gonna
Yeah.
is it gonna
No,
be
no.
like the one in the animation class, or is it a different version of that
Just
turnaround?
a not smooth version where you're just doing 0, 45, and
Got it.
yeah,
Okay.
90. Just it's the same idea. It would be something like this.
Okay.
Yeah, more like that. But you could do it on the same, on the same thing. Animation is just drawing after all. All right, let's draw in the rest of his form now. All right, he kind of just tapers down. His pelvis is kind of just like, let me see what the shape is. Kind of like this.
You showed it briefly earlier, your shorthand for the hip and everything, but I kind of I have missed clipping that image. So what is your shorthand for hips again?
Oh, yeah, let me show you. So overall, it's kind of like, I kind of imagine like what's the term for it? Like a tidy whitey underpants or something. It's kind of what I think of. The way I sort of arrive at that shape, I did this little transformation, right, where I started with a rectangle. And from there, I just rounded out all the edges. Just rounded out all the edges. And the way I did that is I just got rid of I curved the edges, and then I got rid of this corner line, which makes it feel a lot less sharp. Then I made the base wider than the top, so it's a little more trapezoidal. And then you add the penis, as I said, or the mons pubis.
Can't forget.
Yeah.
Is it really art without it?
I don't know. I haven't been adding it, so I guess I haven't been doing art.
I think it's one of life's most mysterious questions that we'll never have answered.
Yeah. All right.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Let's see. There was some proportional things. I might leave that to next time. Well, you know what? We might as well touch on it a little bit. So proportions are those, I'm throwing in sort of the default proportions, but proportions are something that I really want you to play around with and mess around with. For the generic model, it's somewhere from 7.5 to 8 heads tall. I generally will use the head as my measurement for scale. So anytime you make the head bigger, the character automatically feels younger. The character feels as though they're more juvenile, and it makes the body feel smaller overall. If you want to make a character's body look really big, you don't just draw their body bigger, you make their head smaller in comparison. That's kind of like the major trick for that. There are some sort of stereotypical landmarks, which I don't always hit, but yeah, what do we have? We have one head is obviously the head. That makes sense. The second is around the shoulder line to the pectoral muscle. Third is the abdomen. Fourth is the pubic region. Fifth is the upper thigh. 6 is the kneecap. 7 is lower leg to ankle. And then 7.5 to 8 is the feet. Like I said, I don't always, perfectly abide by that because every person is different, and I think it's fun to play around with proportions. But yeah, those are sort of the stereotypical proportions. Yeah, I guess for the end of this, maybe I'll do a little demo of how I go about doing one of these figures. Are there any other questions before I go and do that?
I'm curious with your proportions. Like I've learned like different methods. Like there's the main distinction being more like muscular and like outward shape based proportions versus more skeletal proportions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find use ever for more skeletal proportions?
No, not really. I don't really think about that all that much. Especially because I don't know, because I find it easier just to play around with the shapes a lot. And for me, proportions have always just been more of a thing that came via intuition and just doing lots of loose sketches. But yeah, I've not really paid attention to much of a difference between the skeletal proportions to the full figure, because I always assumed it would be kind of the same thing, but I'm not sure. I could be wrong. You're teaching me something now because I didn't know that.
I think it's mainly, the main difference is it's based on, instead of the head, it's based on the size of the cranium. So
Okay.
Which is about like 2/3, I guess, the size from the top to the chin. And then it just sort of follows that guideline. So It ends
Gotcha.
up being like whatever, like 10 or 12 craniums high, basically.
That's confusing to me.
It's mainly, I've seen it used to just mainly figure out the proportions of the torso rather than the full body.
Gotcha.
But
the only reason why I'm not super concerned about being like so precise is because I love crazy shit like this, where it's just like those proportions don't make any sense. They're ridiculous.
I need to watch that anime again.
Yeah.
It's been a while.
I remember reading something like the difference between torso dominant and limb dominant figures, something along those lines.
Wait, what was that? Limb dominant figures you said?
Yeah, like limb dominant versus torso dominant. Meaning like they derived like a lot of like superhero proportions from like jacked sprinters and stuff like that that were very limb dominant and had like broad waist, I mean, broad shoulders, tiny waist, long legs.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never even knew about that. All right, let me talk about how I go about it. So you already see I'm just starting, and I'm combining kind of all these methods, right? I use a bit of the silhouette to really capture those shapes accurately. I'll steal center lines and maybe wrapping lines from the forms to sort of get that to look, more like what I want, or to get the perspective on that, especially if something's coming at the camera. Like if there's a part of the body that's coming at the camera, I'm definitely going to use wrapping lines for that. And this torso is tilted back, or we've got this curve in the torso. So definitely trying to capture a bit of that. As far as where my lines overlap and that kind of thing, that's really where the muscular anatomy comes into play a lot. I'll just sort of allude to the fact that like this line overlapping this line has to do with the way those muscles intertwine with each other. So for me, that's kind of where that's going to come out the most. Maybe sometimes I'll even start with just a stick figure for the gesture. It's kind of got a weird pose to him right now. And then once I have that sort of gesture line for the, that the sort of line of action for the limbs, now I can start to add in shape and then volume to it.
This is probably an anatomy question that'll be answered later down the line, but when you lift your arms up like that, where is the overlap on the pecs? Because I know they stretch up, but I can't figure out the overlap part.
So sort of what's happening is the way I distinguish all muscles is we've got the body of the muscle and then the tendon. So the body of the muscle is sort of where the main mass, and then we have the tendon, which is doing that sort of pulling. And I always like to make sure that, especially if I'm doing more realistic figures, I like for that tendon to overlap into the muscle itself, kind of like so. And then, like you said, when that gets stretched out, we're sort of flattening that shape a little bit. So the volume there is a little bit thinner. But then this kind of goes into the shoulder muscle right there. So this tendon from the pec is going underneath that shoulder muscle. And if we look at the model that I'm referring to, it all kind of blends into one shape there.
Oh, that's an interesting approach.
So one thing that we'll talk about probably in the next lesson as well, which is finding areas of restraint. So especially when people are sort of newer to drawing the figure, they tend to outline each and every muscle. Like their technique might be something like this, where every muscle is outlined. And there are people that can make that look good if they really, really emphasize the line weight well. And I'm trying to apply a little bit more of that in these figures. But also you can get away with excluding a ton of information. So play around with how much information you don't include with as much as you play around with what information you do include.
It's a really cool approach. I appreciate that because that's what I was looking for.
Awesome. Hell yeah. All right, we're going to do two versions of this guy. I'm stylizing him a little bit here, not enough. We're going to do sort of close to reality, and then we'll do a version where it's a little deviated from reality. And you can see I start pretty loose, focused more on shape.
Deb, you're hot micing.
Hmm?
I said you're hot
Your
micing.
microphone's on while you're clicking away.
What?
Your microphone was on while you were clicking away.
Oh, sorry.
That's all good. That's all good. It happens to the best of us. This guy thinks he's so tough here, flexing, being jacked and shit.
I'm having lots of trouble with third core how do you call it? The quarter. The quarter pose. Yeah.
So my suggestion with that is start real simple. Start with just, you know, if you're struggling rotating just the box into 3/4, start with that. I'll give you guys a bunch of perspective tutorials that I've got stored up. And hopefully that will clarify that a little bit more. Because it is a little confusing because, yeah, once you're in the 3/4, now you're starting to add a lot more depth to it. And it makes that perspective confusing.
James, I don't know if this question is too soon to ask, but like when it comes to line weight and like muscle separation, like do you typically like I noticed that your line weight is thicker on the outline than it is on like an example would be like the outer shoulder versus like the abs.
Yep.
Yeah. Do you usually is that on purpose?
That is. It's very intentional. Part of the reason is I think the silhouette's the most important part, so that's why I try to emphasize that even in the rough sketch. Yeah, I personally like the way that looks, especially since the more subtleties of the muscle groups and that kind of thing are less, those forms are less important. So I try to, you know, not pull all your attention there by emphasizing the silhouette shape first, and then using a lighter line weight for those like little indentations. And that's not something I came up with. That's something that you'll see a bunch of artists do. Even the in the Aladdin ones that we were just looking at before, they're doing the same sort of thing. Another thing you'll notice is the way you draw your shapes when, say, you have a close-up or something at a distance, you've got to use a lot more simplified shapes, right? I'm not using as much detail in terms of the face, right? Because the main focus there now isn't the face. And you know, when a character or a person's far away, you're not going to be drawing all that information because you probably can't see all that anyway. So I always advise draw it how you see it, right? If you see somebody's really far away and you're drawing their eyes, there might just be a couple of shadow shapes that you see. So keep it simple. Cool. And then like I mentioned earlier too, when you're doing these the final line work, or I would say final pencil work, because if I was animating with this, I'd ink over it. Try to have confident line work. I always like my silhouettes to read very well. When we get a little bit more into anatomy, you'll understand some of these interlocking forms a bit better. So that'll make a little bit more sense, but you can already start to get the sense that I'm showing some of the underlying anatomy by which lines overlap and go into the silhouette. And remember what we said about inflection points, right? We can play around with those as well. I'm not doing too much of that yet. We'll do that in the next sketch. But yeah, you can play around with all that stuff. Yeah, like here I can sort of indicate a little bit of that underlying anatomy by using lighter line weights. Right, a lot of that internal line work helps sell what's going on. Otherwise, it's hard to tell what the hell's going on. Right, and when I decide what shape I'm going to use, I really commit to that shape. Right, there's no ambiguity about what shape I'm using anywhere. You know, there are artists that do that. You know, they use lost edges, they use that kind of stuff, which is really a very nice aesthetic look in many cases. But I think for animating, like I said earlier, I like to really show what's going on with the silhouette. Who's the, somebody knows this probably, the main artist from Metal Gear Solid? Somebody's got to know that.
Yoji Shinkawa.
Yeah, he's a perfect example of somebody that leaves a lot of information off, like a lot of information that's not expressed. And that is amazing, right? It looks really cool the way some of the silhouettes just sort of fade out. And you could even do an animation in a Yoji Shinkawa style, and I think that would look epic. But for what I'm trying to accomplish here, I'm like trying to make sure all the silhouette's readable. So I just, my main point is I don't want to ever tell you that you can't do something, because, you know, maybe Yoji Shinkawa is your favorite artist and you want to do that.
What is the homework assignment?
I'm going to write it out for you because it's going to be a long thing. So I have to, yeah, let me write it out after the class.
All right, no problem.
Yeah, that's usually how it goes. You'll get the 4 levels of homework is usually how I do it. I think that worked pretty well in the animation class. And I liked it because then it gives you, you know, multiple ways to do it, even if it's, you know, if some things are more challenging, then you've got some better stuff to focus on. Somebody said if they're beginner, should they focus or should they attempt to do level 4? Yeah, I think so. Why not? Go for it.
Ideally, should you try to do all 4 levels, or will some be redundant with each other?
No, they won't be redundant. So if you can do all 4, definitely go for it. I would be excited to see that. All right, after I'm done with this one, I do have a little bit of time. I don't know if I'm going to finish this next demo, but I'll show you kind of how I would go about doing some stylization. So let's just pull up here, like I have this kill to kill thing here, or this turnaround, right? And we can do sort of a similar pose, but really, really dramatize the shapes the same way that's going on here. So you could imagine, let me do the not flexing one, hold on. I'll do just a generic. All right, so maybe I'm even going to do, maybe I'll start with the skeletal gesture, right? Let's say we do that. Right, this is not always how I would go about it, but just start with a little bit of the gesture. But now let's play around with the shapes, right? We're going to use this really, really dramatic torso shape that tapers down. So I'm going super wide with that silhouette. Super tapered. Epic shoulders, because of course, why not? Gotta have epic shoulders. Might have to make them a little bit taller. You can make some game time adjustments. Don't worry about that. And wherever you can simplify shapes, you should try it, right? Like I said, and we looked at the Aladdin one, right? They really, really simplified that torso shape down to basically just a trapezoid. You know, look at how other artists simplify their shapes. The other thing they're doing here is they're making the arms go really, really low in comparison to the body. So that's another cool thing to, you know, on the actual figure, the arms go to about the hips there, but I'm going to bring them even further down, make them a little bit taller too, so it feels a little more natural. And whenever you're trying to learn to stylize or do design, give yourself baby steps. Start working from a reference and tweak it. Don't just try to come up with everything. Try to draw a reference in the style of another show or something like that, right? Don't just, you know, don't just try to come up with it out of your head. We're not Kim Jong-gi. We don't need to be. It's generally not how designers work anyway, so use lots of reference. And, you know, like if you're concerned about things being too similar to reference, then make executive changes, right? Be like, oh, I want to take this reference and do it in Kill la Kill style, or I want to make it so that I really, really hyper exaggerate these shapes or something like that. That way you're going into it intentionally changing things around. I'm actually gonna move these arms out a little bit. Another thing you might say is like, okay, I'm going to draw this reference, but instead of anywhere there would be a curve, now I'm going to use triangular shapes, or I'm going to use sharper shapes. And that's how you kind of start to develop your style a little bit more. He's got kind of short, stocky legs. Right, in the reference, I can see his hip bone like this. I'm gonna just change that. I'm gonna simplify it down and just make it a simple trapezoid. Right, deviate from reference if you need to. Simplify shapes. Something I should have been a little bit more clear about, but I didn't mention. I guess I kind of did, but the straights versus curves thing. I didn't really get into shape design, but you can kind of see on like this leg, wherever I have a straight line, the other side is curved. We'll get into the details of why all that is in the next class. What a muscle boy. Always drawing gigantic muscle boys. Oh, they got that really long face. Yeah, other simplifying things. Even this, I have this inflection point between the shoulder and the trapezoid muscle. You could even just try simplifying that down. I don't know if I like it better. Yeah, I don't think I do. But that's part of what you got to mess around with your shape design. Is there a question? I heard microphones, so I thought there was a question. You can kind of see from the one on the left to this one on the right, I'm using all the same inflection points basically, right? All the same inflection points. Only difference is now I changed those inflection points. Still have the same idea regarding the forms, right? This bicep is kind of going back in space. Forearms coming at the camera a little bit more. But I'm just deviating the shapes. Okay, so that's the same figure drawn two completely different ways. I'm not going to completely clean this one up right now, but hopefully that is helpful to see how you can play around with that. It's also just really fun. Like this is when figure drawing, at least for me, starts to get fun when you can like, oh, just get my cat in the head. When it starts to get, once you start to play around with it and change things a bit, it gets more exciting. Remember what I said for homework, keep those silhouettes clear. I would like to see them. Don't make daddy upset. Been in class for too long. Yeah, any questions before we get out of here?
James, by keeping the silhouettes clear, do you mean is it scratchy lines or is it line weight or?
Not necessarily scratchy lines or anything, right? So essentially what I'm doing to demonstrate silhouette, like sometimes I'll see somebody draw something like that, right? I can't tell which one of those is a silhouette or if it's like that, right? Because if you're loose and you're drawing it in, how am I supposed to know which one's the silhouette? Well, go in, emphasize which one's the silhouette and tell me, right? If you clearly emphasize your silhouette, your lines could be as loose as you want. And what I'm saying is, like, let's say you have a bunch of really loose, scratchy lines. I'm going in over this and I'm finding that exact curve or that exact inflection, right? The reason being is if somebody's going to go over this and ink it, right? If you're working at an animation, someone's going to ink this, they've got to know which lines to ink over. So if it gets a little ambiguous, they're not going to know what to ink over. Or you're not going to know what to ink over if you're doing it. So even if your lines are loose, say you're like, you've got a loose line, but you're going over it a bunch and really, really emphasizing the line weight, then it's clear which ones are more important. That doesn't mean don't have varieties of line weights. That just means as far as the silhouette goes, I want to be able to clearly identify what that is. I don't know if that clarified it.
It did.
Okay, great. Cool. Yeah, I think that's about it for the class. Next week, I'm deciding what we're going to do next week because it's between two things. So I'll update you guys with everything, and the VOD will be posted. I think it should be clear by the end of the day. So I'll try to get that to you by the end of the day.
Cool.
Cool.
Awesome. And
Thank
yeah,
you very
homework will be
much.
posted right after this. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for the class.
Thanks, James.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.
No problem. I'll see you guys next week.
Alrighty,
Yes.
looking
Now it is
forward
time
to
for
it.
bed.
Awesome
Yep.
class.
Bye, everybody.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.